3 years ago, the story of Lindsay Clancy looked almost painfully straightforward. A mother in Duxbury, Massachusetts, killed her 3 children, then jumped from a second-story window and survived. That was the version most people knew, but now that Lindsay Clancy is on trial, women online are going back through the case and asking whether that version actually explains everything. Some have gone much further. TikTok and Reddit discussions have started suggesting that Patrick Clancy may have played a role in what happened, with the most extreme version claiming that he killed the children and somehow left Lindsay to take the blame. There is no evidence establishing that Patrick killed his children. Lindsay's own defense isn't accusing him either, but there are details here that are genuinely difficult to reconcile. A 25-minute window, 13 psychiatric medications prescribed by multiple providers, doctors who treated Lindsay shortly before the killings, and testified that they saw no signs of psychosis. A woman whose mental state had been deteriorating for months, but who was still carrying out ordinary parts of her life right up until the day everything happened. Those details don't prove a conspiracy. They do explain why people keep digging. And if you follow true crime for the cases where the official explanation leaves you thinking, wait, how does that actually work? This is one of those stories. Lindsay was a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. She and Patrick had 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. After Callan was born, Lindsay's mental health began to deteriorate. She struggled with depression, anxiety, severe insomnia, and suicidal thoughts. She sought psychiatric care, was hospitalized, and saw several different providers. Over roughly 4 months, 13 psychiatric medications were prescribed to her. The list included antidepressants, antipsychotics, sedatives, benzodiazepines, and a mood stabilizer. The defense says this became a case of polypharmacy, multiple providers prescribing different medications without a sufficiently coordinated picture of what Lindsay was taking and how she was responding. The prosecution has challenged that characterization, pointing out that being prescribed a medication doesn't necessarily mean Lindsay actually took every dose. And that distinction became important when Patrick testified. He acknowledged that there were medications Lindsay had barely taken. Prosecutors used that to push back against the idea that she had simply been overwhelmed by 13 drugs. So already the medication story isn't as simple as she was given 13 drugs and they made her do it. But the number is still significant because it shows how many different attempts were being made to treat a woman whose condition wasn't improving. And then the psychiatric diagnoses become even more complicated. The defense says Lindsay was suffering from postpartum psychosis. But the doctors who treated her shortly before the killings did not necessarily see psychosis. Dr. Jennifer Tufts testified that Lindsay had worsening depression and suicidal thoughts, but she did not observe psychotic symptoms. Then came testimony from Dr. Aaliyah Goodhart, the psychiatrist who treated Lindsay during a voluntary stay at McLean Hospital in early January 2023. Goodhart diagnosed severe major depressive disorder without psychotic features. During those 5 days, Lindsay reported insomnia, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. But according to Goodhart, she did not display psychosis. She was cooperative, appeared to improve during the stay, and was discharged on January 5th. That creates a very uncomfortable question for the defense. If Lindsay was already moving toward a catastrophic psychotic episode, why didn't the doctors who saw her just weeks before the killings recognize it? Maybe they missed it. Maybe her condition changed dramatically after she left the hospital. Or maybe what happened on January 24th wasn't the result of psychosis at all. The trial hasn't settled that question. And then there's the final day. Patrick testified that Lindsay seemed fine that morning. She took Cora to a doctor's appointment. Patrick stayed home with the two boys. They exchanged messages. At one point, Patrick sent Lindsay a photo of Dawson after the little boy dressed himself. Nothing about those interactions obviously looks like the final hours before 3 children are killed. That doesn't prove Lindsay was mentally healthy. Someone can be seriously mentally ill and still hold a conversation, take a child to an appointment, and go through familiar routines. But it does create a striking contrast. The prosecution says these ordinary activities are evidence that Lindsay remained aware and capable of making deliberate decisions. The defense says outward functionality doesn't tell us what was happening inside her mind. And then Patrick left the house. According to his testimony, he went out to pick up food and medication. He was gone for roughly 25 minutes. When he came back, all 3 children were dead. They had been strangled with exercise resistance bands. Lindsay had cut her wrists and jumped from a second-story window. She survived, but the injuries left her paralyzed from the waist down. Patrick called 911. The basic physical facts aren't really what the trial is fighting over. Lindsay's defense does not dispute that she killed the children. The legal battle is about her mental state when she did it. But that 25-minute window has become one of the biggest reasons people online started asking questions. 3 children were killed in that period. Lindsay attempted suicide, and Patrick returned to the house and discovered what had happened. People naturally want to reconstruct those minutes. What happened first? How long did each part take? What exactly was Lindsay doing before Patrick came back? And could everything described by the prosecution realistically happen within that window? None of those questions establishes that someone else was involved. But they are legitimate questions about the timeline. Then there is Lindsay's account of her own mental state. She later described experiences involving a voice that she said was telling her to kill the children so she could kill herself. For the defense, that is one of the most important pieces of evidence supporting psychosis. But again, the timing matters. The doctors who treated Lindsay shortly before the killings weren't seeing hallucinations or delusions. So the prosecution can point to the medical record and say the professionals who actually evaluated her didn't see psychosis. The defense can point to what happened later and argue that the condition escalated after those evaluations. The jury has to decide which interpretation makes more sense. And this is where Patrick becomes interesting to people following the case. Not because there is evidence that he killed the children. There isn't. Patrick was simply the person closest to Lindsay during the months when everything was getting worse. He knew about her suicidal thoughts. He knew she was receiving psychiatric treatment. He saw the changes in her behavior and testified about conversations in which Lindsay talked about disturbing thoughts involving the children. At one point, he asked her whether she thought she should be kept away from them. She said no. Patrick testified that he didn't believe the children were in immediate danger. That decision is something people naturally scrutinize now, knowing what happened later. Could he have recognized the danger sooner? Should he have done something differently? Did he underestimate how sick Lindsay had become? Those are very different questions from asking whether he murdered the children. And the distinction matters. Patrick himself has supported the idea that Lindsay was severely mentally ill. He has publicly said that he forgives her. He also filed a medical malpractice lawsuit connected to the treatment Lindsay received, arguing that healthcare providers failed to properly treat her condition. So the picture of Patrick as a secret killer doesn't fit neatly with the position he has actually taken. But neither does that automatically answer every question about him. This is where the online discussion becomes especially intense. Women following the case aren't necessarily saying Lindsay is innocent. A lot of them are focused on something else. The possibility that the people around Lindsay knew she was deteriorating without realizing just how dangerous the situation had become. What makes the story especially difficult for many women is the gap between how Lindsay's life looked from the outside and what was apparently happening behind closed doors. She was a trained medical professional, had 3 children, and was surrounded by people who knew she was struggling. Yet there was no single moment when everyone around her seemed to realize that the situation had become an immediate danger. For women who have experienced postpartum mental health problems, that part of the story can make the case feel very different from the usual true crime narrative. They recognize the parts that happen before the crime: exhaustion, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, fear, shame, and the feeling that something is wrong without necessarily knowing how serious it is. That doesn't prove Lindsay was psychotic. It doesn't make her innocent. It does explain why some women are looking at the case through a completely different lens. And then the speculation about Patrick enters the picture. Some people think he failed Lindsay. Some think he contributed to her deterioration. Some believe the relationship itself deserves more scrutiny. And a smaller group has moved all the way to the theory that Patrick killed the children. Those claims should not be treated as one argument. There is a massive difference between criticizing someone's decisions as a husband and accusing them of murdering 3 children. The second claim requires evidence. So far, that evidence has not been established. In fact, there's a major detail that works directly against the theory. Lindsay's own defense isn't accusing Patrick. Her lawyers aren't saying Patrick did this. They're saying Lindsay did it, but that her mental state made her legally incapable of being held responsible. That is a completely different defense. And if convincing evidence emerged that Patrick was actually the killer, it would fundamentally change the case. So we're left with something much more interesting than a simple conspiracy theory. There are genuine inconsistencies in how Lindsay's mental state has been described. The defense says severe postpartum psychosis. Doctors who treated her shortly before the killings testified that they didn't see psychosis. The defense emphasizes 13 prescribed psychiatric medications. The prosecution points out that Lindsay did not necessarily take all of them. The defense describes a woman whose condition was spiraling out of control. The prosecution points to a woman who was still functioning, communicating, and making deliberate choices. Both sides are looking at the same months of Lindsay's life. They're just telling 2 completely different stories about what those months mean. And that's where I think the real mystery of this case is. Not whether TikTok has proved Patrick did it. It hasn't. The more interesting question is whether anyone actually understood how bad Lindsay's condition had become before January 24th. Because Patrick says there were warning signs. The medical records show repeated attempts at treatment. Lindsay herself was asking for help, and yet the doctors who evaluated her closest to the killings did not diagnose psychosis. Then, within weeks, 3 children were dead. That is an enormous gap to explain. And the jury now has to decide whether the prosecution's explanation closes that gap or whether the defense has shown that something much more complicated was happening inside Lindsay's mind. There are also questions about the final 25 minutes that the public may never get a completely satisfying answer to. Not because that automatically means somebody else was involved. Sometimes a short timeline is simply a short timeline, but because every minute matters when the entire case turns on what Lindsay was capable of thinking and doing during that period. The same goes for her fragmented memories. If those memories were the result of psychosis, they could explain why her account doesn't resemble a normal recollection. If they weren't, then the jury has to consider them very differently. Again, there isn't a clean answer yet. And that's why this case has become so compelling. The internet wants a villain. The prosecution wants to show a deliberate act. The defense wants the jury to see a catastrophic psychiatric illness. And online, some people have created an entirely different story involving Patrick. But the evidence doesn't currently allow us to jump from "this detail is strange" to "therefore Patrick killed the children." The case leaves us with a much harder picture than the original headline suggested. Lindsay had been getting psychiatric care for months, but the treatment never produced a clear answer about what was happening to her. The people around her knew she was struggling, yet the morning of January 24th still looked ordinary. And then, within a matter of hours, everything changed. That's what makes this case worth following. Not because we already know Patrick is guilty. We don't. Not because we already know Lindsay is innocent. We don't know that either. It's because the evidence leaves enough unanswered questions that the original, simple version of the story no longer feels sufficient. And as the trial continues, those questions are finally being tested against testimony, medical records, and evidence instead of TikTok theories. If you want more true crime deep dives where we follow the evidence, pick apart the contradictions, and separate what's actually known from what people online are claiming, subscribe. Because this trial is still unfolding, and there are still questions that haven't been answered.